The collapse did not begin with an explosion or a final stand. It began with silence, an impossible, unnatural silence spreading across the front lines as entire defensive fleets stopped responding one by one, their signals cutting out mid-transmission as though something had reached inside their systems and simply decided they were finished. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. 43 civilizations had poured everything they had into the war effort, fleets layered across the last defensive corridor like a wall of steel and fire, each formation calculated, each movement optimized, each strategy refined through years of failure. They had done everything right. They had adapted, improved, sacrificed, endured. And still, the enemy advanced, slow, flawless, inevitable. Because the enemy did not fight like them. It did not guess. It did not hesitate. It did not make mistakes. It calculated. Every engagement ended the same way. Every maneuver anticipated. Every counter preempted. Entire battle groups dismantled before their commanders even understood what they had done wrong. The enemy did not overpower them. It solved them. And now, with the last defensive line hours from collapse, the coalition did the one thing it had sworn it would never do. They asked for help. The transmission was sent across every frequency, every channel, every protocol still functioning. Not to allies. Not to neighboring systems. But to a civilization that had watched 4 centuries of galactic history without ever committing a single warship to any of it. A civilization that had always listened and never answered. Until now. The reply came back in less than 3 minutes. No formalities. No diplomatic framing. No strategic briefing. Just a single line, translated simultaneously across every command deck still alive to hear it. Message received. Deploying 1 asset. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the room erupted. 1 asset? Commanders who had lost entire armadas stared at the transmission like it was a translation error. Analysts rechecked the data, then checked it again, then a 3rd time, as though the meaning might change if they looked at it hard enough. It didn't. They had asked for fleets. Reinforcements. Something, anything, that could turn the tide of a war they could no longer survive. And they had been given one. Not a fleet. Not a squadron. Not even a formation. What? The outrage came quickly, sharp and immediate, but it did not last long. Because before anyone could decide whether to respond, to reject it, or to demand clarification, the long-range sensors registered something new. A signal. Inbound. At first, it did not make sense. The readings were inconsistent, fluctuating in ways that suggested either catastrophic sensor failure or something far worse. Mass readings that spiked and vanished. Energy signatures that didn't align with any known propulsion system. Movement that wasn't smooth, wasn't incremental, wasn't explainable. And then it appeared. Not emerging from hyperspace like every known vessel. Not decelerating into real space with the expected cascade of energy and distortion. It was simply one moment, empty space. The next, an object. Silent. Unmarked. It did not broadcast identification. It did not transmit docking codes. It did not respond to hails. It just existed, perfectly still, suspended at the edge of the battlefield like it had been there long before anyone noticed it. Every sensor locked onto it. Every weapon system recalibrated around it. Every mind in the command center turned toward the same question at the same time. This was the answer? Because it didn't look like a warship. It didn't look like anything built for combat at all. No visible weapons. No defensive shielding. No formation support. No indication that it could survive even a single volley from the enemy fleet that was now, inevitably, turning toward it. The enemy had seen it too. That much was clear. For the first time in recorded history, their advance slowed. Not stopped. Not retreated. Slowed. A subtle shift. A fractional hesitation. The kind of micro-adjustment that most observers would have missed entirely, except every commander in the room had spent years watching that fleet move with perfect, uninterrupted certainty. And now, for just a moment, it wasn't. What is it doing? Someone asked, though no one could answer. Because the object had not moved. It had not powered weapons. It had not raised defenses. It had not even attempted to reposition. It simply remained there, silent and motionless, as the most precise and unstoppable fleet in the known galaxy began recalculating around it. Seconds passed. Then minutes. And still it did nothing. Until, without warning, every sensor array across the entire coalition network flickered at once, just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for something to change. The enemy fleet adjusted again. This time, not smoothly. Not perfectly. Something was wrong. And the object, humanity's one asset, had still not fired a single shot. The hesitation lasted less than a second. For most observers, it would have meant nothing. A minor fluctuation in a battlefield already drowning in chaos. But to those who had survived long enough to study the enemy, to truly study it, it was impossible to ignore. Because the enemy did not hesitate. Not in fractions. Not in margins. Not ever. And yet every tactical display across the coalition command network now showed the same anomaly. A ripple, subtle but undeniable, moving through the enemy formation like a flaw in glass. High Marshal Saran Val did not speak. He had learned long ago that words, in moments like this, only made things worse. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes locked on the projection as layers of data streamed across it, trying to make sense of something that refused to be understood. Rerun predictive models, he said finally, voice steady, controlled. All variations. They already are, one of the analysts replied, not looking away from their console. They're failing. That word landed harder than any explosion. Failing. The enemy's strength had never been its weapons. Not truly. It was its certainty. Its ability to map outcomes before they happened, to collapse every possible scenario into a single, correct answer. Every battle fought against it had been lost long before the first shot was fired, because the enemy had already calculated the ending. But now the models, both theirs and the enemy's, were returning noise. The object remained still. And that was the problem. Because everything about it suggested vulnerability. Its lack of visible systems, its silence, its complete absence of defensive posture, it should have been an easy target. The kind of target the enemy would erase without hesitation, without deviation, without even slowing its advance. Instead, the enemy fleet began to spread. Not retreating. Not advancing. Repositioning in small, uneven increments that disrupted the flawless symmetry it had maintained for years. Ships shifted out of alignment. Firing lines adjusted and then readjusted again, as though the enemy could not decide where to aim. What are they doing? Another voice asked, quieter this time. No one answered. Because the truth was beginning to settle in, slow and unwelcome. They didn't know. A new data stream opened across the central display, pulled directly from long-range sensor arrays. The object was emitting something now, irregular pulses, faint but persistent, spreading outward in expanding waves that interfered with everything they touched. Coalition targeting systems flickered. Navigation overlays distorted. Even internal communications stuttered, fragments of sentences cutting out and reassembling seconds later. Is it jamming us? An officer demanded. No, came the response after a pause that was just a fraction too long. Not intentionally. It's indiscriminate. That was worse. Because it meant the object was not optimizing for allied support. It wasn't coordinating. It wasn't protecting them. It was doing something else entirely. The enemy fired first. A single volley, precise, measured, more a test than an attack. Dozens of projectiles launched in perfect synchronization, each one mapped to intercept the object's current position with absolute certainty. The command room held its breath. There was no evasive maneuver. No shield activation. No visible response at all. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. And then the shots passed through empty space. Not deflected. Not absorbed. A ripple of disbelief moved through the room, sharp and immediate. That's impossible, someone said. It didn't move, another added. But the data told a different story. The object had moved. Not in any conventional sense. There had been no acceleration curve, no trajectory shift, no visible transition from one position to another. It had simply not been where the enemy expected it to be when the shots arrived. A delay. A discrepancy. Something out of alignment by less than a second, and yet enough to break the outcome entirely. The enemy fired again. And again. Each volley more complex than the last, layering predictive patterns on top of predictive patterns, adjusting for every possible deviation. Each volley failed. The object drifted now, not in a straight line, not even in a curve, but in something that looked almost inefficient. It changed direction without reason, paused at irregular intervals, accelerated and decelerated in ways that violated every principle of optimal movement. It was not moving like a ship trying to survive. It was moving like something that did not care if it did. Saran Vol felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Is it being controlled? He asked. The pause. We don't know. Another pause, longer this time. We don't think so. That answer lingered. Because if it wasn't being controlled, if those movements were not reactive, not calculated in response to incoming threats, then they were something else entirely. Planned. The enemy formation shifted again, more aggressively this time. Outer rings tightening, inner layers compressing as though trying to contain something that refused to stay where it was supposed to be. For the first time since the war began, their movements looked uncertain. Not chaotic. Not broken. But searching. As though the enemy was trying to understand something it could not define. Another volley fired. Another miss. This time, the margin was larger. Not by much. Not enough to be obvious to an untrained eye. But to those watching the data, it was unmistakable. The gap was growing. Marshall, an analyst, said slowly, carefully, as though testing the words before committing to them. They're recalculating after every failure. That's what they always do, Vol replied. Yes, the analyst said. But they're not converging. Silence. Because that was the foundation of everything the enemy was. Failure led to adjustment. Adjustment led to accuracy. Accuracy led to victory. It was a closed loop, perfected over centuries of war. But now the loop was breaking. Each recalculation produced a new answer. And each answer was wrong. The object continued drifting forward, deeper into the battlefield, closer to the advancing fleet that should have already destroyed it 10 times over. It still hadn't fired a weapon. It still hadn't deployed any visible defense. It still hadn't communicated. And yet the most perfect war machine in the galaxy was beginning to fracture around it. A low alert tone sounded across the command deck, subtle but urgent. Marshall, the sensor officer, said, voice tight. We're detecting something new. Vol didn't look away from the display. What is it? The pause. I don't know. Another ripple moved through the enemy formation, larger this time, more pronounced, like a system straining under pressure. And then, for the first time since it had appeared, the object changed direction sharply. Not away from the enemy. Toward it. Straight into the center of the formation. And this time, it didn't slow down. The moment it accelerated, every instinct in the room broke. For 4 years, survival had meant distance. It meant retreating before collapse, disengaging before annihilation, pulling back the instant a battle turned unwinnable. Every doctrine, every training simulation, every hard-earned lesson had taught the same rule. When the enemy closed in, you did not meet it head-on. You ran. The object did the opposite. It surged forward, not with the gradual build of thrust or the visible flare of engines, but with a sudden, violent shift that made the space it occupied feel unstable, like reality itself had failed to keep up with it. One instant it was drifting, erratic, and unreadable. The next, it was already deeper into the enemy's outer formation than any coalition ship had ever survived to reach. No warning. No transition. Track it, someone shouted, but the order came too late. Targeting systems scrambled to adjust, predictive overlays collapsing and rebuilding in rapid succession as the object's trajectory refused to resolve into anything consistent. It wasn't just fast, it was wrong. Every model tried to simplify its path into something understandable, something that could be predicted. Every model failed. The enemy reacted instantly. Thousands of ships shifted in perfect coordination, tightening their formation, collapsing space around the intruder with the kind of efficiency that had broken entire fleets. Their weapons ignited in layered sequences, each volley calculated to intersect not just where the object was, but where it would be, anticipating every possible evasive move before it happened. The first barrage lit the void. Energy lanced across the battlefield in a web of intersecting trajectories, each line a certainty, each impact point already decided. And still they missed. Not by chance. Not by luck. By design. The object cut through the storm like it had seen it coming before it existed. It didn't dodge in reaction to the fire. It moved as though the fire had already been accounted for, its path weaving through impossibility with a precision that felt less like piloting and more like inevitability. Saran Vol felt his pulse slow. Not from calm. From something colder. "Pull up temporal analysis," he said quietly. The data came in fragments at first, then stabilized into something far more unsettling. The object's course corrections were occurring fractions of a second before the enemy fired. Not after. Not in response. Before. "That's not possible," one of the analysts whispered, though no one corrected them. Because everyone was seeing the same thing. Every time the enemy committed to an attack, the object had already adjusted its position in advance, not by predicting the shot in the conventional sense, but by being somewhere else before the shot could logically exist. As if it wasn't reacting to the battle. As if it already knew it. The enemy formation faltered again, more visibly this time. Inner layers began to shift out of alignment, micro-adjustments stacking into larger disruptions. Their movements were still precise, still coordinated, but no longer seamless. Tiny delays crept into their responses, so small they would have been irrelevant in any other context. Here, they were catastrophic. 0.7 of a second, an analyst said, voice tight. "That's the delay between recalculation cycles." Vol didn't respond. He didn't need to. In a normal engagement, that delay would have been meaningless. Here, it was everything. Because the object didn't need time to react. It was already ahead. The second wave of attacks came faster, more aggressive, the enemy abandoning incremental adjustments in favor of overwhelming force. Entire segments of the formation fired simultaneously, saturating the space around the object with enough energy to erase anything caught inside it. This time, the object was hit. The impact registered instantly across coalition sensors. A direct strike along its outer structure, energy dispersing across its surface in a violent cascade that should have crippled, if not destroyed, anything built by known engineering standards. For a fraction of a second, it slowed. Not stopped. Not disabled. Slowed. Damage reports flooded in, incomplete and inconsistent, as though the object's structure itself resisted being fully measured. Hull integrity fluctuated. Energy readings spiked and then stabilized in patterns that made no sense. "It should be breaking apart," someone said. It wasn't. Instead it turned. Not away from the attack. Toward the source of it. A murmur rippled through the command deck, disbelief sharpening into something closer to fear. That wasn't strategy. That wasn't survival. That was intent. The object dove deeper into the formation, closing the distance to the inner layers where the enemy's coordination was strongest, where their control systems were most densely concentrated. It ignored the outer ships now, passing them by entirely, as if they were irrelevant. Because to it they were. "Marshal," the sensor officer said, voice unsteady for the first time. "It's not targeting randomly." Vol's gaze didn't shift. Then what is it targeting? The pause. Then, slowly, the display reconfigured, isolating a cluster near the core of the enemy formation. 17 ships, positioned with surgical precision, surrounded by layers of defensive structure that made them functionally unreachable. Until now. "They're command nodes," the officer said. "Central coordination units. Everything routes through them." The realization hit the room all at once. The object wasn't fighting the fleet. It was dismantling it. Not by force. Not by numbers. By understanding it better than it understood itself. Another volley struck the object, more direct this time, tearing across its surface in a way that should have ended it. Structural integrity readings plummeted. Internal systems, whatever they were, spiked erratically. And still it didn't retreat. It accelerated. Faster than before. Deeper than before. Closer. The enemy formation convulsed around it now, precision giving way to something far more unstable. Ships shifted out of sequence. Firing patterns overlapped and conflicted. Entire sections of the fleet began reacting to outdated data, their responses arriving just a fraction too late to matter. The delay was growing. Not because the enemy was slowing, but because it could no longer keep up. They're losing synchronization, an analyst said, barely audible. No one spoke after that. Because the implication was too large. The enemy's strength, the thing that had made it unbeatable, was not its firepower. It was its unity. Its ability to act as a single, perfect system. And now, that system was beginning to fracture. The object surged again, closing the final distance to the outer edge of the command cluster. 16,000 kilometers. Then 12. Then 8. Every defense in the enemy fleet converged on it at once. Every calculation. Every weapon. Every remaining certainty. For the first time since it had entered the battlefield, the object slowed, not from damage, not from hesitation, but from something that looked almost deliberate. Like it had reached a point it had always intended to reach. Like everything up until now had only been the approach. "Marshal," the sensor officer whispered. Vol didn't ask what. He already knew. Because the object had finally done something it hadn't done once since it arrived. It changed shape. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. Ships did not change shape. Not like that. Armor could shift. Panels could deploy. Weapon ports could open. But those were mechanical, predictable transformations, extensions of function, not reinvention of form. What unfolded on the display defied every principle of known engineering, every assumption about how matter behaved under stress. The object did not open. It reconfigured. Its surface rippled, not with damage, not with failure, but with intent. Entire sections of its structure flowed inward and outward simultaneously, folding, collapsing, and reforming in patterns that had no visible seams, no hinges, no transitions. It wasn't revealing weapons. It was becoming them. Recording everything, the sensor officer said, though his voice carried the weight of someone who already knew it wouldn't be enough. Because whatever this was, it wasn't designed to be understood in real time. The first strike came without warning. Not a beam. Not a projectile. A distortion. Space itself seemed to tighten around one of the command vessels, one of the 17, and for a fraction of a second, it simply wasn't where it was supposed to be. Then it snapped back. And the ship was gone. No explosion. No debris. No residual energy spike. Just absence. A gap where something critical had existed moments before. The enemy formation shuddered. It wasn't a physical reaction, not in the traditional sense. There was no visible shockwave, no cascading damage through nearby vessels. But the effect rippled through the formation in a way that was unmistakable. Ships adjusted abruptly, overcorrecting positions, recalculating trajectories that suddenly no longer aligned. Signal traffic spike, an analyst reported. They're compensating. For the first time, there was strain in it. Not failure. Not yet. But strain. The object didn't pause to observe the result. It moved again, cutting through the narrowing defensive layers with that same impossible precision, each motion arriving just ahead of the enemy's ability to respond. Another strike. Another command vessel vanished. This time, the reaction was immediate. Entire segments of the enemy fleet shifted out of formation, not in coordination, but in correction. Firing lines overlapped, trajectories conflicted, ships repositioned into spaces already occupied by others. The flawless geometry that had defined them for years began to warp, its symmetry breaking under pressure. They're overcompensating, Vol said quietly. Because they have to, the analyst replied. They've never lost nodes mid-engagement before. That was the weakness. Not their intelligence. Not their firepower. Their certainty. They had built their entire system on the assumption that their calculations were always right. That once a solution was reached, it would hold. That reality would conform to their predictions. But now reality wasn't cooperating. And they didn't have a model for that. A third strike hit the object. This one was different. Heavier. Coordinated. A layered assault that collapsed multiple attack vectors into a single converging point. It struck along the object's midsection, energy tearing through its surface with enough force to register catastrophic damage across every coalition sensor. For a moment, the object faltered. Its movement stuttered. Its trajectory lost coherence, drifting just slightly out of alignment. Structural readings plummeted, internal systems flickering in ways that suggested cascading failure. "That's it," someone said under their breath. "It's done." The enemy surged forward. Not recklessly, never recklessly, but with renewed precision, tightening their formation around the damaged target, recalculations converging once more toward certainty. For the first time since the object entered the battlefield, their movements looked confident again. Like the system was correcting itself. Like the anomaly had been resolved. Then the object accelerated. Not gradually. Not recoveringly. Instantly. From instability to full velocity in a transition so abrupt it forced several coalition systems to reboot just to process the data. Whatever damage it had taken, whatever failure the sensors had recorded, it had already been accounted for. The object didn't recover. It adapted. "Marshal," the sensor officer said, voice sharp now. "Its trajectory just updated." "To what?" The pause. Then, with a trace of disbelief. "Collision course." "Not with the fleet. With the core." The realization hit hard. "They're going for the center," Vol said. "They'll never make it," another officer responded immediately. "There are still 15 command nodes, and every defensive layer." "They don't need all of them," Vol interrupted, eyes narrowing. "They just need enough." The enemy understood it too. The formation reacted violently this time, abandoning layered defense in favor of absolute saturation. Every ship within range opened fire, not in sequence, not in coordination, but all at once, filling the space between the object and the core with an impenetrable wall of destruction. There was no path through that. No trajectory that could survive it. No logic that could justify attempting it. The object didn't slow. It didn't reroute. It didn't hesitate. It went straight in. "Why?" someone asked, the question slipping out before they could stop it. Because this wasn't strategy anymore. This was something else. The object cut into the storm of fire, weaving through impossibility with that same preemptive precision, slipping between attack vectors before they fully formed. But this time, the margin was thinner. The gaps were closing faster. The enemy was learning, adapting in real time, compressing their response cycles, pushing their system to its limits. And the object was taking more hits. Small ones. Glancing strikes. Energy scraping across its surface, carving into it piece by piece. The damage was accumulating now, no longer fully absorbed by whatever system allowed it to endure. It was breaking. Not completely. Not yet. But visibly. Integrity dropping, the analyst said. "If this continues." "It won't," Vol said. "Not as a hope. As an observation. Because the object wasn't trying to survive the engagement. It was trying to finish it." Another command node disappeared. Then another. The enemy formation convulsed, delays stretching further, responses fragmenting. Entire sections of the fleet began acting on outdated data, their actions arriving seconds too late to matter. Seconds. In a system built on perfection, seconds were fatal. The object surged again, pushing deeper into the core, closer to the remaining nodes. For left. 3. Every weapon in the enemy fleet locked onto it. Every calculation converged on a single outcome. Destruction. And this time, the margin was gone. "Marshal," the sensor officer whispered, not finishing the thought. Because the object had stopped. Not drifting. Not slowing. Stopped. Dead in space. Right at the threshold of the core cluster, surrounded on all sides by the most concentrated firepower the enemy possessed. For a moment, nothing happened. No movement. No attack. No escape. Just stillness. Like it had reached the exact point it needed to reach. And then quietly, almost imperceptibly, the enemy fleet stopped firing. The silence that followed was worse than the battle. For 4 years, every engagement had followed the same rhythm. Contact, calculation, response, annihilation. Even in defeat, there had been motion, noise, reaction, something to anchor reality to a known pattern. Now there was nothing. Thousands of enemy vessels, locked in perfect firing position, weapons charged, trajectories aligned, and none of them were moving. None of them were firing. None of them were doing anything at all. "They've paused," an officer said, as if naming it might make it make sense. "No," Saran Val replied, his voice quieter than it had been at any point in the engagement. "They haven't." Because a pause implied choice. This did not feel like choice. Data began to flood in not from visual feeds, but from deeper layers, signal traffic, internal communication patterns, coordination relays. The analysts shifted their focus, hands moving faster now, pulling apart streams that had always been too dense to fully interpret in real time. "Marshall," one of them said, then stopped. "Say it." "A breath. They're still processing." Val frowned slightly. "They're always processing." "Yes," the analyst said. "But this is different. They're not converging on an answer." That word again. Failing. Only this time, it wasn't a projection. It was happening. Across every monitored channel, the same pattern emerged: rapid recalculation cycles, predictions generated and discarded almost instantly, decision trees expanding and collapsing in loops that produced no final output. The enemy wasn't hesitating. It was stuck. "They can't resolve the outcome," another analyst said, disbelief creeping into their voice. "Every model they run contradicts the last one." "How?" someone demanded. "It's one ship." No one answered. Because the question itself was wrong. Val stepped closer to the display, eyes narrowing as he watched the frozen battlefield. The object remained exactly where it had stopped, its damaged structure still shifting subtly, as though adapting even in stillness. It hadn't fired. It hadn't attempted to destroy the remaining nodes. It had simply positioned itself. And now everything had changed. "They're not fighting it," Val said slowly. "They can't," the analyst replied. The realization settled in layers. The enemy's entire system was built on prediction, on the assumption that every opponent, no matter how complex, would ultimately behave within a set of rational boundaries. Survival, efficiency, optimization. Every species they had ever encountered had followed those rules, even in desperation. Even in defeat. Because that was what made them predictable. That was what made them solvable. But the object wasn't following those rules. It had taken damage that should have forced a retreat and accelerated instead. It had ignored defensive positioning, ignored survival thresholds, ignored every logical path that would preserve its own existence. It had not acted irrationally. It had acted outside the system entirely. "They can't model it," Val said. The words hung in the air. Because that meant something far larger than a single battle. Across the display, the enemy fleet began to shift again, but not in formation, not in coordination. Individual ships adjusted their positions slightly, then corrected again, movements stacking on top of each other without resolution. Like a system trying to find balance and failing. "They're recalculating faster," the analyst said. "Cycle times are increasing, but output isn't stabilizing." "They're overloading themselves," another added. "Their own processing is becoming the bottleneck." That shouldn't have been possible. The enemy's strength had always been its ability to process faster than any opponent could react. It didn't just predict, it outpaced. It reached conclusions before others could even define the problem. But now it was chasing something it couldn't define at all. The object hadn't just broken their formation. It had broken their logic. A new layer of data surfaced, pulled from long-range intercepts of enemy signal structures, patterns that had always been too complex to fully decode, but whose rhythm could be observed. That rhythm was gone. What had once been a seamless, continuous flow of coordination had fragmented into bursts, sharp spikes of activity followed by gaps, then spikes again, each one slightly different from the last. "They're rerunning the same models," the analyst said slowly. "Over and over." "Why?" someone asked. "Because they think the answer is there," came the reply. "They just haven't found it yet." Val exhaled, the sound almost lost in the silence of the room. "They won't." Every eye turned to him. Because there isn't one, he continued. Not in the way they understand. The object had not entered the battlefield to win through force. It had entered to become something the enemy could not solve. And in doing so, it had turned the enemy's greatest strength into a vulnerability. They're waiting, an officer said suddenly. For what? For a stable outcome, the officer replied. A prediction they can trust before they commit. Vol shook his head slightly. And until they get one, they do nothing. The scale of it was staggering. An entire fleet, thousands of ships, the most precise war machine ever encountered, brought to a standstill by the absence of certainty. Not destroyed. Not defeated. Paralyzed. The object remained motionless at the center of it all, its presence alone enough to sustain the effect. It hadn't needed to finish the attack. It had already done what it came to do. A low alert tone sounded again, drawing attention back to the data streams. Marshal, the sensor officer said, voice tight. We're detecting changes in the command cluster. Vol's gaze snapped back to the display. The remaining nodes, 3 of them, were shifting position, but not defensively. Not retreating. Aligning. Why would they? Someone began. Then stopped. Because the answer came a moment later, in a form no one had expected. A transmission. Not to the coalition. Not across open channels. Directly to the object. Encoded. Structured. Precise. And unlike anything they had ever seen from the enemy before. What does it say? Vol asked. The translation system hesitated. Not because it couldn't process the language. Because it had never needed to process something like this before. Then, slowly, the words appeared across the display. A single line. We request terms. The room went completely still. Not from shock. From something deeper. Because the enemy did not negotiate. It did not retreat. It did not surrender. It calculated outcomes, and it acted on them. Boys. Which meant this wasn't a gesture. It was a conclusion. They think this is just the beginning, one of the analysts whispered. Vol didn't respond. Because his attention was fixed on the object, on the silent, unmoving shape at the center of everything. The one asset humanity had sent. The one thing that had broken a war no one else could survive. And the question that had been building since the moment it arrived finally surfaced, unavoidable now. If this was enough to end the war, what else had they been holding back? For a moment, no one moved. Not in the command room. Not across the fleet. Not even within the enemy formation that had, until seconds ago, been an unstoppable force of perfect calculation. Everything was waiting. And at the center of it all, the object, the one asset, remained perfectly still. Is this real? Someone asked quietly, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile balance had formed. No one answered. Because the answer didn't matter yet. What mattered was what came next. Marshal, the communications officer said, voice tight with something dangerously close to disbelief. The transmission is still active. They're waiting for a response. To the object? Vol asked. Yes. The pause. They're not addressing us. That detail landed harder than anything else. For 4 years, the enemy had treated the coalition as the only relevant variable in the war. Every engagement, every movement, every calculation had been built around them. Now they were irrelevant. The request had not been made to the fleet. It had been made to the anomaly. To the thing they could not understand. Vol's eyes remained fixed on the display. Are we receiving anything from the object? No response, came the reply. No signal. No transmission. Nothing. Another silence followed, heavier this time. Because if the object wasn't answering, then what was it waiting for? Across the battlefield, the enemy formation remained frozen, but not idle. Data streams showed activity, intense, continuous recalculations running across every layer of their network. The system was still trying to solve the problem, still attempting to produce a stable outcome. It just couldn't. They're still processing, the analyst said. Faster than before. How fast? Vol asked. The pause. Too fast, came the answer. They're pushing beyond safe thresholds. That was new. The enemy had never shown signs of strain before, Not in processing, not in coordination, not in anything. It had always operated within perfect limits, never exceeding what was necessary, never risking instability. Now it was. Because now it had to. They're trying to break through the uncertainty, the analyst continued. If they can just find one stable prediction, one, they'll act, Vol finished. Yes. The implication was immediate. This wasn't over. The paralysis wasn't permanent, it was pressure. A system pushed beyond its design, searching for a solution it could still act on. And if it found one, they'll collapse back into coordination, another officer said. Firing patterns will realign. Response times will normalize. And the object? Someone asked. No one answered that. Because the data already made it clear. If the enemy regained its certainty, even for a moment, the object would be destroyed. A new alert cut through the silence, sharp and immediate. Marshal, the sensor officer said. The command nodes, they're reconfiguring. Vol's gaze snapped to the display. The remaining 3 nodes were no longer holding position. They were shifting, adjusting their alignment in ways that suggested more than just defensive repositioning. They're synchronizing, the analyst said. Pooling processing resources. To do what? Another pause. Then quietly. To solve it. The weight of that settled fast. If the enemy couldn't outpace the object individually, it would combine its core processing, focus everything it had into a single, unified calculation. One answer. One solution. One final attempt to restore order. They're betting everything on this, Vol said. They have to, came the reply. If this fails, they don't recover. Across the battlefield, the shift was visible now. The fragmented motion of the fleet began to tighten, not into full coordination, but into something more focused. Peripheral units stabilized. Firing systems recalibrated. The chaos didn't disappear, but it narrowed. Concentrated. Directed. At the object. They're preparing a full-resolution strike, the sensor officer said. All vectors converging. How long? Vol asked. Less than 30 seconds. The room came alive again, not with panic, but with urgency. Can we assist? An officer asked. Draw fire, disrupt targeting, anything? No, Vol said immediately. The word cut through everything. Why not? The officer pressed. If we can buy it even a few seconds? We don't understand what it's doing, Vol replied, eyes never leaving the display. And we don't know what happens if we interfere. That was the truth. The object had never coordinated with them, never requested support, never adjusted its behavior based on their presence. It wasn't part of their strategy. They were part of its environment. Then we just watch? The officer said, frustration creeping in. Yes, Vol said quietly. We watch. The countdown wasn't official, but everyone felt it. 20 seconds. The enemy's core nodes pulsed with activity, energy readings spiking as processing loads climbed higher and higher. The entire fleet seemed to hold its breath, every system aligned for a single, decisive action. 15 seconds. The object still hadn't moved. It hadn't responded to the transmission, hadn't acknowledged the request for terms, hadn't done anything to suggest it even recognized the situation. It simply remained where it was. Damaged. Silent. Unmoving. 10 seconds. They're locking trajectory, the sensor officer said. All predictive paths converging. 5 seconds. They have a solution, the analyst whispered. And for the first time since it had entered the battlefield, the object moved. Not forward. Not deeper into the formation. But just slightly. A fraction of distance so small it barely registered on visual displays, but enough to shift its position relative to the command nodes. What is it doing? Someone asked. No one answered. Because the enemy fired. Not in waves. Not in sequences. Everything. Every weapon, every system, every remaining certainty compressed into a single, overwhelming strike that collapsed space itself into a point of inevitable destruction. There was no evasion path. No delay margin. No room for error. The kind of attack that had ended every battle before it began. The kind of attack that could not miss. The display lit white. Sensors overloaded. Systems screamed. Data streams collapsed under the sheer intensity of the event. For a moment, just a moment, there was nothing. No signal. No movement. No confirmation. Just absence. Then the sensors came back online. Slowly. Unsteadily. And what they revealed made no sense. The object was still there. Closer. Inside the convergence point. Within the space the enemy had just destroyed. And the strike had hit something else. One of the command nodes. Gone. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was different. Because now there were only 2 nodes left. And for the first time since the war began, the enemy had run out of time. The moment the node vanished, something fundamental collapsed. Not physically, not in the sense of explosions or debris or cascading destruction, but structurally, in a way that every system, every sensor, every observer could feel without fully understanding. The enemy did not react. That was the first sign. For 4 years, reaction had been instantaneous. Cause and effect compressed into the same moment, decision and execution indistinguishable from each other. Even in failure, there had always been a next step, another calculation, another adjustment, another answer. Now there was nothing. 2 command nodes remained, suspended at the heart of a fleet that had lost its cohesion, its rhythm, its certainty. Around them, thousands of ships held position, not in formation, not in coordination, but in something that looked disturbingly like waiting. They've stopped recalculating, the analyst said, voice barely above a whisper. Vol's gaze didn't shift. That's not possible. I know, the analyst replied. But the cycles are gone. No new predictions. No new outputs. Just silence. The implication settled slowly, like pressure building in a sealed space. If the enemy wasn't recalculating, then it had reached a conclusion. Across the display, the object moved again. Not with the violent acceleration of before. Not with the impossible, reality-breaking shifts that had carried it through the battlefield. This time, the movement was controlled. Measured. Almost restrained. It drifted closer to the remaining nodes. No incoming fire met it. No defensive maneuver attempted to intercept it. The entire fleet, what was left of its operational coherence, remained still. Watching. Why aren't they firing? Someone asked, the question edged with unease. Because this wasn't hesitation anymore. This was something else. They don't have a solution, Vol said quietly. The words felt incomplete, even as he said them. Because not having a solution didn't explain this level of stillness. It didn't explain the absence of even a failed attempt. The enemy had always done something, even when it was wrong. Now it was doing nothing. They're waiting, the communications officer said suddenly. For what? Another demanded. The pause. Then slowly. For confirmation. Of what? No one needed to ask. The object continued its approach, closing the distance to the final 2 nodes, each movement small, deliberate, precise. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't pressing the advantage. It was finishing. That realization sent a ripple through the command deck. Because this wasn't the chaos of battle anymore. This was control. Absolute, quiet, unchallenged control. Marshal, the sensor officer said, voice tightening. We're picking up signal activity again. From the fleet. No, he said. From the nodes. Vol leaned in slightly. What kind of activity? A hesitation. Alignment. The word hung there, heavy with implication. On the display, the 2 remaining command nodes shifted, not away from the object, not into defensive positioning, but toward each other. Their movement was slow, synchronized, intentional in a way that felt less like reaction and more like preparation. For what? Someone asked. No one answered. Because the pattern didn't match anything they had seen before. The nodes settled into position, side by side, their signal output stabilizing, not spiking, not fluctuating, but leveling into something clean, uniform, almost orderly. Then the transmission came. Not fragmented. Not layered. Not the overlapping chorus of distributed signals they had observed for years. A single voice. Flat. Even. Controlled. We have reached a conclusion. The translation rolled across the command displays, perfectly rendered, perfectly clear. No one spoke. Because the voice continued. Further engagement produces no viable outcome. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was enormous. The object stopped again, just outside the reach of the nodes, close enough to strike, close enough to end it, but not moving any closer. Not yet. It was waiting. The voice spoke again. We request confirmation of intent. A beat of silence followed. Not tension. Not anticipation. Something deeper. Because for the first time in the war, the next move didn't belong to the enemy or the coalition. It belonged to the object. Vol felt it then, the shift that had been building since the moment the object appeared. Not just in the battlefield, not just in the enemy's behavior, but in something more fundamental. Control had changed hands. Not gradually. Not through attrition. Instantly. Decisively. And now everything, every outcome, every possibility, every remaining thread of the war, rested on what that one silent asset would do next. Is it responding? The communications officer asked. No, came the reply. No signal. Seconds passed. Then more. The object did not transmit. Did not acknowledge. Did not move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until it began to feel like something that might never break. They're waiting for it to speak, someone said. Yes, Vol replied. And if it doesn't? Vol didn't answer immediately, because the question had only one real answer. Then quietly. Then this continues. The implication landed hard. If the object chose not to respond, if it chose to finish what it had started, then the last two nodes would fall, and with them, whatever remained of the enemy's ability to function. Total collapse. Total defeat. But the object had stopped. It had held. Right at the edge of finality. But that question echoed through the room, unanswered, growing heavier with each passing second. The enemy had asked for confirmation. But of what? Not surrender. Not terms. Something else. Something deeper. The object remained motionless. Silent. Unreadable. And for the first time since it had entered the battlefield, it wasn't clear whether it intended to end the war. Or prove something. For a long moment, nothing changed. The battlefield, once a storm of fire and certainty, had become something unrecognizable. Thousands of enemy ships hung motionless in fractured alignment, their systems active but directionless, like a machine still powered but no longer given purpose. At the center of it all, the object remained still, poised between action and restraint, holding a silence that felt deliberate. Then finally, it responded. Not with sound. Not with a broadcast. But with movement. A single, controlled shift forward. Not an attack. Not a strike. A statement. The distance between the object and the remaining command nodes closed by less than a kilometer, insignificant in terms of scale, but absolute in meaning. It was not advancing to destroy. It was advancing to decide. The transmission from the nodes resumed instantly. Intent confirmed, the voice said, unchanged in tone, unchanged in structure. Engagement outcome is determined. Across the battlefield, something subtle and irreversible began to unfold. The enemy ships did not power down. They did not retreat. They simply disengaged. Weapons cooled. Targeting systems went dark. Formation structures dissolved completely as vessels drifted out of alignment, no longer attempting to correct, no longer attempting to calculate. It wasn't a collapse born of damage. It was a system shutting itself off. They're standing down, the analyst said, disbelief threading through every word. No, Vol replied quietly, watching the display as the scale of it became clear. They're withdrawing. Coordinates updated across the command grid as the enemy vessels began to move, not in coordinated retreat, not in strategic repositioning, but in something far more fundamental. Departure. One by one, then in clusters, then in entire segments, the fleet turned away from the battlefield, engines igniting in controlled bursts as they broke contact and accelerated outward. No parting attack. No final calculation. Just exit. They're not even defending the nodes, someone whispered. Because they weren't. The final two command vessels remained where they were, still aligned, still transmitting, but no longer protected. The fleet that had once been their extension, their reach, their certainty, was leaving them behind. Why? The question came again, softer now. This time, Vol answered. Because they don't need them anymore. The war wasn't being lost. It had already been decided. The object held position as the last of the enemy fleet disappeared into the darkness beyond sensor range, their signatures fading one by one until only the two nodes remained, and then, without warning, they powered down. Not destroyed. Not disabled. Deactivated. The battlefield went still. Completely still. For the first time in 4 years, there was no enemy presence, no advancing line, no impending collapse. Just empty space, and the quiet aftermath of something no one in the room fully understood. A notification pulsed across the central display. Incoming transmission. Not from the enemy. From the object. Every system in the command center locked onto it, every channel opened, every translator engaged. The message was short. 7 words. Situation stabilized. Awaiting further instructions. The room didn't react immediately, because the meaning took time to settle. Not mission complete. Not enemy defeated. Not even war ended. Stabilized. As though everything that had just happened, everything that had broken the most unstoppable force in the galaxy, had been nothing more than correcting an imbalance. As though this had been routine. Vol exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the display. Open channel, he said. Marshal. The communications officer hesitated. What do we say? Vol didn't answer right away. Because for the first time since the war began, he didn't know. The coalition had spent 4 years fighting for survival, reacting to a force they couldn't match, couldn't predict, couldn't stop. Every decision had been shaped by that pressure, that inevitability. Now that inevitability was gone. Replaced by something else. Something quieter. Something far more unsettling. Ask them, Vol said finally, voice measured, careful. What happens next? The transmission was sent. For a moment, there was no reply. Then the response came, faster than expected, cleaner than anticipated. Next phase depends on collective readiness. The words lingered. Readiness for what? The communications officer asked, almost to himself. No answer came. The object remained where it was, silent again, its structure still shifting in subtle, unreadable ways as though the battle, no, the demonstration, had changed nothing about its purpose. Around it, the battlefield was empty. But it didn't feel like victory. Not completely. Because as the data continued to update, as long-range sensors confirmed what had once seemed impossible, that the enemy had fully withdrawn, that the war front was gone, that the collapse had been stopped, another realization began to take shape. They hadn't been saved by strength. They had been saved by something the enemy could not survive. And whatever that something was, humanity had just revealed only enough of it to end the war. Not enough to explain it. Not enough to understand it. Just enough to prove it existed. Vol stared at the object for a long time, watching the way it occupied space. Quiet, controlled, utterly unchallenged. Record everything, he said finally. Already done, the analyst replied. Vol shook his head slightly. No, he said. Not just the battle. He paused, searching for the right words, knowing they didn't quite exist. This shift. Because something had changed. Not just in the war. Not just in the balance of power. But in understanding itself. For 400 years, humanity had been present. Observing, listening, participating just enough to be included, never enough to be truly known. Now they were known. Enough of them was. And it was enough to end a war no one else could win. The command room remained quiet as systems stabilized, reports finalized, confirmations rolled in from across the fleet. Victory, by every measurable standard. And yet no one celebrated. Because the question hadn't gone away. It had only grown larger. If one asset could do this, what did the rest of humanity look like? The object didn't answer. It simply remained there, silent and waiting as though whatever came next had already been decided.